This is the last panel of the day. This is the panel that's supposed to tie everything together in a nice box with a bright red bow on it, and when we leave, we'll have put all the pieces together. And we have 4 great panelists today, and we have some very hardy souls here as well. A couple of people who have come in at the last minute because 2 of our scheduled panelists have had to cancel at the last minute. I think we can speculate in a little bit about why they had to cancel when we come back to the local control issue. But for now, we've had 2 original panelists and two people who've stepped up to the plate at the last minute, for which we're very appreciative. So because we're short on time, I'm not going to spend much time on introductions. They're in the materials, at least for 2 of the 4. But we have Elise Jones, who is a Boulder County commissioner, and also very active in the NGO community before being elected to that position, the Colorado Environmental Coalition. So in some ways can bring 2 hats to the table at this discussion. Next is Teresa Rice from Encana Oil and Gas. Teresa is manager of supply chain and contracts at Encana. She's also a member of the board of advisors of the Getches-Wilkinson Center. And so thank you very much, Teresa, for joining us at this last minute. Our second last minute fill-in is Professor Mark Squillace, who introduced himself to you yesterday when he moderated the afternoon panel. Of course, he is a law professor here at CU, specializing in water and environmental law, and he was the executive director of the Natural Resources Law Center for many years before it became the Getches-Wilkinson Center. And then finally, we have Joan Card, who is with the Environmental Protection Agency Senior Policy Analyst. Do I have that right? Senior Policy Advisor. Great. And thank you very much, Joan, for joining us as well. I thought, given that we have a Boulder County Commissioner here and also representatives of industry and academia, that it would be good to just continue a little bit of the focus on the local control issue that Professor Collins highlighted for us and that one of our colleagues just mentioned in the last comment during the Q&A. And perhaps just ask everybody but Joan to offer just a few perspectives, more from a policy point of view, about what's really driving this debate. What are some of the issues and the concerns that really lead to this becoming such a contentious issue? And I guess one question, given that, as Professor Collins told us, there are some discussions going on right now about whether there could be some type of a legislative solution that could preempt a ballot initiative or in some ways reduce the likelihood of a ballot initiative. I'm told that those discussions in Governor Hickenlooper's office are continuing this afternoon. That may or may not be why 2 of the people on the original panel are not here. I won't speculate about that. But it did. But it looks like those discussions are still germane and that there could be a chance of a special session being called next week. So with that intro, Elise, maybe you could start off with just a few thoughts from a local government official's perspective and your own perspective about what's really driving this debate.
Well, thank you, and thanks so much for having me. I, too, am a bit of a last-minute draftee. I was drafted on Tuesday. I'm supposed to be Dan Grossman. So I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a former state lawmaker. I'm not a mild-mannered man. So he offered me a beer to do this, and you can decide whether or not I, won the deal or not. But at any rate, appreciate the opportunity to be here. I do think it's important to understand the context for local control. I think you all have been hearing a lot about the latest science and the risks and the progress around air and water quality. But if you look at local control, for the past 100 years, communities and their local elected officials have been using zoning powers and regulatory powers to prevent incompatible uses from being together. And there is an expectation that local electeds like mine will protect residents from things like having hazardous waste facilities or power plants or marijuana grow facilities or pawn shops in residential neighborhoods, for example. And The sole exception to that is oil and gas. And so that's the context with which we are dealing with development now at an unprecedented rate. Through the marriage of fracking and horizontal drilling, we are seeing development in neighborhoods up and down the Front Range. And folks are taken aback. And there's an expectation that, just as with every other industrial use, zoning and other protections will be in place to keep that kind of activity away from people's homes or schools or hospitals. And there's an expectation of folks who are elected that we're going to be able to do something should there be a development proposed near a school, for example, which has happened in this region. And for me to tell folks, my constituents, that no, actually I don't have the authority, the state won't let me say no, is a hard pill for people to swallow, because it doesn't exist for any other land use. And so as we look at local control, I think it's important to understand that this is a different beast and something that no one's really been asked to experience before. And as a local elected official trying to represent my constituents, I'm trying to balance compliance with the law and my ability to change the law, and we'll see if that happens. And yes, indeed, the colleagues that aren't with us today are down in the governor's office reading through the draft of the potential compromise. I have to measure that against, balance that against, this notion that you all have been hearing about with regards to a social license to drill, and whether or not the expectations that residents have about protection of their health, protection of their private property values, their quality of life, if all of that's being adequately protected. And at the end of the day, I have to say to you as a local government official, I don't have the tools in the toolbox that I need to adequately say to my constituents, folks who live in this community, that we've got them fully protected to the level that they would like. And so the debate about local control is really about balancing the playing field and adding more tools to the toolbox, similar to how local governments are able to address every other land use.
Great, thank you.
For context.
Thank you. Teresa, could you maybe talk a little bit about the other side of the debate? What are some of the concerns that industry brings to this issue, and is there a middle ground somewhere between the status quo and absolute local control that are being explored, or where is Encana on this issue today?
Well, I'm not in the public relations or community relations part of Encana, but I do keep up on these issues, and I am aware of what's going on. So I'll comment more from someone in the company who's not directly involved with these issues day to day. But I think Encana would like to have one set of rules to deal with when they conduct their operations. I think most operators would, or some consistency, predictability. And I think, probably there are a lot of scientific questions after listening today, questions that aren't fully answered right now. And I can understand the public's concern that nobody's really addressing these issues, and air quality and water quality. I think there's some concern that local governments may not have the scientific expertise to address these issues. But they certainly, have an interest in seeing them addressed properly. And then there's something that was raised earlier, I think the pooling concept. Some of the pooling regulations, whether they're right or wrong, given the technology we're using today, do cross local government boundaries, and we wouldn't want to be operating under different rules for each side of that boundary.
Great, thanks. Mark, this is something that you've, I know, been looking at from an academic perspective for a while. Any thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, thanks, Britt. I would like to sort of offer just a little different perspective. And I guess I don't want to think about this so much from the legal side, but more from the policy side. We've been talking a lot about social license to operate and just how we get along, I guess, in allowing oil and gas development while protecting our communities. And much of what Elise said, I think, resonates with me as a member of this community. I thought I would sort of preface my comments by reflecting on a story by John McPhee. Some of you are undoubtedly familiar with it. He wrote one of my favorite books, Encounters with an Archdruid, which I'm sure some of you know was an encounter between David Brower, the former head of the Sierra Club, and 3 developers. And one of those developers was a mineral developer, a guy by the name of Charles Park, was actually a professor at Stanford University. And it's a wonderful kind of encounter, if you will, where they talk about their different perspectives on mineral development. And at one point, Charles Park says that he would develop a mine in Yellowstone National Park if that's where the minerals were, because minerals are where you find them, and you've got to develop them where they are. And I thought about that in the context of some of the discussion we've had over the last couple of days. And what strikes me about the particular issues that we're talking about here is that we really have an opportunity to maybe do something a little different with unconventional oil and gas development. And that's because we're not locked in to where we find the minerals, at least not for the surface impacts. Because you can go out 2 miles and more in some cases now from the place where you're actually drilling, you've got some flexibility in choosing where to site your well pad. Now, my reading of the Longmont fracking ban is that it probably wouldn't allow that drilling underneath the city as well. But it strikes me that there is maybe some opportunity for compromise or working together on these issues if we think a little bit more about the needs of the community and sort of the social license to operate, and the idea that we want to provide communities with some ability to decide for themselves what kinds of restrictions they're going to allow, while at the same time perhaps trying to accommodate mineral development and promoting and encouraging better siting decisions, if you will, that avoid some of the adverse impacts that might be felt by the community, even if those impacts are being felt in some aesthetic way or some way that other people might not find objectionable. So it seems to me that we really do have an opportunity here, and part of what we need to do, it's going to be hard to do this year. We've got all these initiatives, some of which are likely to land on the ballot, and so we're likely to be in a somewhat confrontative mode, I think, until the election's over. But there are some opportunities here for us to talk about solving these problems in a way that allows communities to engage in the kind of planning that Elise was talking about, while still allowing some oil and gas development to occur, even if it's occurring under the cities.
Great, thanks, Mark. So, Joan, we've spent a lot of time talking about this difference between state and local regulatory efforts, but we've also spent a bit of time talking about the federal-state relationship and what the future holds in that regard. Could you just give the group an overview of where you think EPA is going on this suite of issues over the next few years, and how you're viewing your role?
Sure, thanks for the opportunity to be here. Mic on? Okay. And thank you, Britt, for recognizing that local control discussions are way outside of EPA's lane. But I can, and I'm happy to talk about EPA's relationships with states and maybe tribes too, a little bit in this context.
Yeah.
And it would take too long to do an overview of EPA's role in general, so I won't try to go there. But I guess I would hit the point that EPA has had a long relationship with states, and in fact, many state DEQs, or state environmental agencies, were created in response to EPA's creation for the very purpose of working with EPA. So we have this long-standing relationship, so states can receive federal delegations for certain programs, that kind of thing. In the oil and gas arena, it's a little bit different, we haven't had these long-standing relationships with oil and gas commissions who permit much of the activity that may be that EPA, that's really not a federal permitting program per se. Obviously, there's some overlap with the underground injection control program, but oil wells have been permitted by states forever, as long as there have been oil wells without any EPA role. So I'd say, just like many areas of oil and gas, that's a developing relationship with a different part of the state. And then, of course, the state environmental agencies are also figuring out how to work with the state oil and gas commissions. So that's an evolving and important relationship. But if I could take just 1 minute to very quickly and sort of answer the second part of your question, sort of what is EPA doing and what are we thinking? I guess overall, we're interested in working with states to strengthen protection of our air, water, and land programs with the purpose of protecting public health and the environment, but also sustain natural gas production and job growth. We're interested in supporting implementation and verification of best practices. And I think that's something that's been touched on today, and it's something that we're really starting to think about internally at EPA is what could our role be in these sort of verification arena. Obviously, we are out there inspecting facilities in accordance with our standard inspection protocols and our existing environmental programs. But is there more that can be done? Really very interested in some of the things that were hit on at this conference, and looking forward to further discussion and development of those ideas and what EPA's role might be in that. But we do have a couple of specific initiatives, and so I want to hit those real quickly because they're important and they're timely with respect to public involvement. So we've issued an advance notice of proposed rulemaking under the Toxic Substances Control Act. And an advance notice of proposed rulemaking is really just a formal request by EPA for formal public input on what we might do under the Toxic Substances Control Act with respect to chemical disclosure in the oil and gas arena. And we've asked a series of specific questions about that we're seeking your input on. And really hope you'll take a look at that and invite your comment on that. Two more real quickly. President Obama's strategy to reduce methane emissions. There's an oil and gas component to that you may or may not be aware of. And EPA, in response to the President's strategy, has issued 5 technical white papers that are very specific. And Cindy Beeler of EPA, who spoke earlier on a panel, is very knowledgeable about the specifics of these white papers. But really hoping people, especially with technical knowledge of the oil and gas industry and design and operations, will look at those papers and give EPA feedback on options for further reducing methane emissions from these facilities. And then finally, I would mention, as part of this methane strategy, that EPA has announced that we're going to build upon our existing natural gas START program, which was also mentioned, I think, by an industry, a member of industry on a panel earlier, as being something that they thought was very effective and useful. And so the idea is to make it even more effective and more useful. And I guess we're proposing a Gas Star Gold program, so enhanced effort with maybe more teeth. And I just invite you to go look at, I'm happy to talk to you, give you any materials. We have a nice fact sheet that lays it out with a schedule, but it's very timely, so please become engaged in that effort.
Great, thank you.
Oh, and I'm sorry,
Oh, sure.
I did want to mention with respect to tribes, we do, obviously we have, like other federal agencies, a federal trust obligation to work effectively with tribes, help tribes meet their own needs. And but one thing we do that I think is often forgotten, especially here in Region 8, where we have responsibility in the states of North Dakota, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, where we have so many tribes and Indian country where we do direct implementation, is what we call it. We actually do the permitting, right? So in our offices in Denver, we have permit writers doing underground injection control permits for enhanced oil recovery in the Uinta Basin on the Uinta and Array Reservation. So I think people often forget that EPA is not just making policy in these areas, that here in the regional office we're actually implementing these laws and permitting programs.
Great, thank you. All right, well, I've got one more very broad question for each of the 4 panelists, and then I'm going to turn it over to the audience for Q&A. I think the purpose of this session really is to allow for a much more give and take and dialogue among the whole group than perhaps we've had to date just because of time constraints, but we will have quite a bit of time. So be thinking about what types of questions you want to throw out or what sort of points you want to make. But before that, though, just one last general question from me, and that, Patty started us out with the concept of trust, and then a number of people pointed out that's sort of permeated the entire 2 days of discussions, that it's almost come up, in every presentation. The levels of trust are going down, levels of conflict are going up. That's occurring even in places like Colorado, where we have the reputation of having a relatively sophisticated regulatory regime. And given that this panel is called Recommendations on a Path Forward, it just struck me that it'd be nice to look at that set of issues and the way that they've been articulated over the last couple of days and just ask each panelist to think of some very concrete, practical, on-the-ground ways that we can begin to build trust on this set of issues and foster the type of true engagement and collaboration that speaker after speaker after speaker has said that we need. So, Elise, can I ask you first?
You want me to start again?
Yeah,
Sure.
Well,
part of what could be done is to not do some of the things that have been done in the past. So I don't want to start with the negative, but for example, I dug this out of a box not so long ago, and it's a nice glossy direct mailer piece that says a looming threat to Colorado's economy. And then it goes in, new job killing rules. And this was one of like 6 direct mail pieces that ended up in my mailbox back in 2007 when we were doing the update to the state rules that all of us now look back on with, great satisfaction, and it's a meaningful step forward. Industry agrees, everybody looks back and doesn't think anything about it. But at the time, it was a bloody fight. And so one of the things that I think that industry could do is don't always say no to regulation. Be the leader in helping craft the best protections. And this is really a state level suggestion. I have to say it was very refreshing with the new air rules to have Noble and Canna and Anadarko step up to the plate with environmental defense and start talking about, well, how can we move the ball forward? And you can argue that the air rules didn't go far enough, but I think we have to recognize that they were a victory. And that was the first time I've seen industry step up to the plate like that, and it was very, it was exciting to see. And so I would encourage the industry to take opportunities to be the leader and not to say no, but to say yes to the protections that folks are asking for. So that's one thing. And I'll be more positive. I feel like some companies in particular are starting to really engage locally and have conversations at the local level. That's a positive step forward in terms of building trust. I would encourage companies to be willing to invite citizens to come out when they monitor and do leak detection. Have citizen teams join you so that they can see what you're seeing and they can be a part of ensuring compliance with local and state regulations. I think transparency is going to be so important, and there hasn't been enough of that. There have been baby steps, not even baby steps. Frac Focus, for example, was Colorado's answer to dealing with disclosure of fracking fluids. That database is not workable, it's not searchable, it is not accessible to the public. So that was a failed attempt at transparency. We need transparency that actually folks can sit down at their computers and understand exactly what's going on in their neighborhood. And I think industry, if industry could embrace that kind of transparency, that would go a long way in local communities to helping create a partnership. And along those lines, to admit when mistakes happen, be the first one to say, oops, we had a spill, this is what we did, come out and look, see if we got it all, we'll do some soil tests, here's the answer. Be the one to initiate that. If industry can do a better job at that, that also would go far in helping bridge and rebuild some of the trust that's been ruptured on this debate. So that's a handful of things that I think would be helpful to start moving the ball in that direction.
Great. Thank you very much. Teresa.
You stole my ideas.
That's a good thing.
Actually, they're similar, but I think, I know my company was involved in frac focus before it was required reporting the chemicals. I didn't realize it wasn't a usable tool. But beyond that, we've also developed an internal program called Responsible Products. And so we've gone a step further and developed our own requirements from what we think are more stringent than required of products that can be used by our vendors. And we've started looking at ways of requiring the vendors contractually to comply with the requirements. And that is primarily in the area of fracturing services. But it also applies to other services that might use chemicals. Forming partnerships, I think, like we heard about with Mark, from Mark today, with EDF is going to be an important step. And Canada was involved, as was already mentioned, with the air quality regulations. I think we need to do more of that. Admitting when we're wrong, but also admitting when we don't know the answer, I think is going to take us far in developing some trust. And then finally, I think just continuing to build on the communications and getting out there and communicating with local communities, trying to communicate in a way that people can understand and give them, when we can, as much information as we can. That's it.
Great, thank you. Mark?
So I want to talk a little bit about the breakdown in trust in terms of what I see as, to some extent, a failure of an adequate planning process. And so if we think about an oil and gas field, sort of a typical oil and gas field, we've got lots of developers, maybe some smaller and some larger operators doing lots of different things in a fairly concentrated area. And the regulatory agencies that we have dealing with these big field developments, they tend to be reactive. I mean, we've done some great things in Colorado with our air rules and some other things, and there's some good restrictions on how oil and gas is done. But I think what we've not done very well with is upfront planning. I was with my field class this past semester. We were down in western Texas. We studied the Rio Grande Basin, and part of the area we toured was the Permian Basin, where there's just an amazing amount of oil and gas development going on. It's mostly liquid fuels down there. And it seemed like every couple hundred feet there was another well pad. And there's this spider web of infrastructure that goes along with all these thousands of well pads that are in this area. You know, power lines to every site, roads and all kinds of infrastructure, tanks at every site. And we visited a rig, had a great tour of a company that's trying to do good things at its own site. It's a horizontal well going essentially in one direction. I suspect because of the ability to acquire property rights. And what screamed out at me, I guess, watching what's going on, sort of the big picture, I probably should know more about it than I do to be able to claim this, but it seemed to me that folks hadn't thought through how you develop a large oil and gas field like that. I mean, we heard Gary Kaufman today talk about, wouldn't it be great if we had pipelines that could take the liquids and the gas away from the sites so that you wouldn't deal with these flashing problems that he talked about in the tanks. Every one of these little wells has a tank where they're presumably leaking methane, and there are potentially problems there. But it doesn't make sense to talk about a pipeline if you haven't sort of thought through these issues in advance, if you haven't figured out where can we put the well pads to maximize resource development, recovery of the resource, and minimize the footprint and the environmental impact that we're causing. But that kind of thing doesn't happen when your regulatory agencies are reactive and not proactive. But if you think about, we have processes, and some of our cities and counties follow NEPA-like processes to do environmental impact assessments, and it just doesn't happen enough. You know, the BLM actually does this, or they claim to do this kind of thing for their oil and gas development, but they don't really do anything more than sort of talk about areas where you can and can't develop. They still are very reactive in terms of not sort of helping the companies design the right places to put that well pad, to make sure you're putting multiple wells on that well pad to minimize impacts and to maximize the efficiency of the production of the resource. I just think there's a whole lot more that we can do with this planning exercise, and I think we've really only scratched the surface of that now. And what Phil Esposito was talking about earlier struck me as the kind of thing that maybe could lead to more of this kind of thing. He was talking about a couple of communities they're working with. I think one of them was in Pennsylvania, and maybe this is something along the lines of what he was talking about. But I really think we've not paid enough attention to the upfront planning side and trying to design oil and gas development in a way that makes sense both for the companies and for the environment.
Great, thanks. Joan.
On public trust, I guess I would dip my toe into the local control issue, only as an analogy to what Elise said about being able to respond to constituents effectively and in the ways that they have expected. You know, EPA is always working to engender the public trust. It's inherent in who we are and what we do. And I think in part because of the you know, exemption, the RCRA exemption from hazardous waste regulation for E&P waste, and because of the exemptions for hydraulic fracturing from underground injection control permitting, and the exemption from stormwater requirements for oil and gas, those kinds of things. There may be a couple more. We find ourselves in a similar position. You know, we're creatures of statute. We can't do anything directly on those issues, and so we are always working on public trust, and I think that's also has reflected to some degree on the industry itself. And then I would just say I think that there's a lot, again, that there's a lot of opportunity with verification programs, and really looking forward to the good work that's already underway and enhancing the opportunities to verify that operators are acting not only in compliance with the laws that exist, but also the best practices that can and should apply.
Great. All right, well, thanks to all four of you. Those are some very interesting, very concrete ideas to ponder. So, all right, at this point, let's throw it open to all of you. And great, we've got a first question over here.
This isn't actually a question, but I'll keep it really short. Okay. Since I'm sitting here with my laptop in my lap and we were talking about frac focus, I Googled it and I've discovered, in the interest of fairness, I want to point out they're now up to frac focus 2.0, and I got on and it asks you to enter information, so I said Weld County, and then I quickly realized I wasn't going to be able to find a well I knew where was easily, but you can enter well number or well name, or if you know the location. But I picked one called Critter Creek, and I discovered it was fracked in 2011. It's owned by EOG. The supplier of their chemicals was Halliburton, and it gives me a long list. They used water, sand, BE7, which is a biocide, mostly bleach, low surf 3000, which is a non-ionic surfactant, and it lists a series of ingredients for that. They claim their Gargum gelling agent, Gargum derivative, is proprietary, and so forth. So it's got a big long list here. I think, you know, they're in the process of improvement, and I think should be recognized for such. And probably if we looked at it more closely, we could kick them about doing something else as well.
Great, thank you. Sean,
Could I respond to that?
Sure.
Part of back when the fracking fluid disclosure rule for Colorado was being debated, people were really clear that they wanted to be able to go in and see aggregated searchable data about what's happening in my county, in my neighborhood. What can we add up the level of chemicals and the concentrations that are happening in a particular watershed? And none of that is easily done, or none of that can be done on Frac Focus, and that was promised as a part of that rulemaking, and it is yet to be delivered. And that was what I was whining about, which is if we want to really be transparent, and that was the whole idea of a disclosure rule, then we need to give people the information that they deserve and that they want. We need to make it easy for them to find the answers to the questions. And so I was just saying there is an example of supposed transparency that doesn't actually work. So.
right here.
Most of the discussion yesterday and today has dealt with the oil and gas development that's occurring right now. But has anybody given thought to what's going to happen to this infrastructure 20 years from now? When the Encanas and Noble and Anadarkos, when production goes down and it's no longer profitable for them, they'll sell to another smaller company, which in turn later on will sell to an even smaller company. So I've inspected a lot of oil and gas sites up in Wyoming, and the ones that have the most spills and other problems are the older ones that are 20, 30 years and smaller operators. They don't have the resources to really keep the infrastructure up. So that's where you have all your spills. Has anybody given thought to the future? And also, my other question is, if you drive down, this morning I drove Highway 66, which is just north of Longmont, and right there you can see a rig and a big gathering facility right next to a residential subdivision and a park. And what about, I mean, if I was a homeowner and that was behind my house, I'd be really concerned. Aside from the health impacts and the unknowns there, what about screening those type of industrial infrastructure? I mean, as a homeowner, I wouldn't want a whole series of tanks and separators and all that. Surely the industry's thought about visuals and how to make that a little bit better for the homeowners.
Anybody want to tackle those?
Sure.
Two
And,
issues.
funny, I have something to say on that. Well, on the first one, have I thought about it? Yeah, it keeps me up at night thinking about the legacy of what this development might have. And looking at Boulder County, one of the problems that we've had here is it doesn't fit with the expectation that residents have for their quality of life, and it doesn't fit with our economy to have a landscape riddled with industrial infrastructure that particularly as it deteriorates over time and it doesn't comply with environmental protections. Oil and gas doesn't make sense in a quality of life, natural resource-based economy like ours, and we're not alone in that. You know, people come to Boulder County, as you know, because it's a beautiful place to live, great outdoor recreation, clean air, clean water for what you can see out the window and what you can do on the weekend. None of that works very well with drill rigs and well pads. And if you want to see a difference in sort of economy and philosophy, drive across to Weld County, where you can't throw a rock without hitting a pump jack. And I am concerned about what's going to happen. And in fact, the Weld County farmers come across the border and ask for help from us because Boulder County does a lot better job at protecting its agricultural heritage. Those farmers come and say, what's going to happen in 20 years, when I'm supposed to farm that land and the soil's not reclaimed? And so it's an issue. And certainly every time we move forward with greater regulations of industry, somebody, often the governor, says, well, let's not hurt the little guys. We don't want to put them out of business. And yet, those are the operations that can't actually afford to comply. It's not the big companies that tend to do a much better job. So that is an issue. And regarding visual impacts, that's a huge problem. And one of the ironies is the industry is thinking now that the way to deal with that is to put up these huge curtain barriers. And it's about 50-50 about whether or not people think that's a better thing to look at than what's behind it. But it, again, from an economic impact, people don't move to Boulder County to look at industrial complexes. That's not what they want to see out their bedroom window. That's not where they want to recreate. And so as we move forward with trying to figure out our energy future, we have to make sure that development doesn't undermine our existing economy, which is sustainable and not a boom and bust, but will sustain us decades and decades long after these pump jacks and drill rigs are gone. So those are some of my thoughts on that.
Great.
Yes, I would just have a couple of comments. I know that I'm not sure if it was Weld County or Boulder County, but because of the way we can drill today, we were able to move our pad further away from development. I think that's a better possibility today than it used to be. So because of opposition, we were able to move our pad further away, and we could diagonally reach the same resources we were trying to reach. So I know that companies are looking at that more and more. And also that people still need jobs, and they still need to heat their homes. So we've got to develop it where it is. And I don't think we can say we're not going to do it in one place, but we'll let the other place do it, but we'll reap the benefits by having the resources that we need when we need them.
I think there was a question, or two questions there.
Yes, in regards to your discussion about the public trust, in order to regain the public's trust, I would suggest Googling a website, doing a Google search under Portland, Oregon People's Water Trust.
Sorry, one more time. Portland, Oregon's?
Portland, Oregon, City of Portland, Oregon.
Yep.
People's Water Trust.
People's Water Trust.
Yes.
Okay.
It deals with local control, and it deals with the balance between development and the environment. And the way it's written, if that it could be used on either a citywide, countywide, or state level basis, and rather than try to say what it involves, I'd rather leave that up to you all to take a look at that initiative. It's presently going on. It's gathering signatures right now, and I think the deadline for signatures is July the 7th, if I'm not mistaken. But I believe that could be a good solution to the overall Colorado water plan, to the fracking issue, and to what's going on at the legislature, to at least take a look at that and see if you could adapt the language of that to the situation here in Colorado.
Great, thanks. So a potential model, perhaps.
Yes.
I think there was one other question here, or no?
I can kind of, on one hand, I don't want to be, I don't think NIMBYism is really the right approach to this either, because it's very easy to say, I don't want it here. But I guess my question is, there are some communities that are, I think, more open to the idea of having it in their borders, where the focus is more, for example, in Weld County, and I realize I'm painting this with a very broad brush. I'm sure there are differing opinions in every community, but the focus there seems to be more, we want the development, we want the jobs, versus the kinds of things that Elise was talking about, Boulder County wanting to preserve recreation and their way of life. And I guess what my question is actually a technological one. You were talking a minute ago about, I'm sorry, and by you I mean Teresa, talking a minute ago about being able to move the development, move the development away from an area of concern. I guess the question is, how connected, and this is actually a question, how connected is the resource under Boulder County to the resource under Weld County, and how easy would it be to get at, because we were talking about pooling a little bit earlier, is this the kind of resource that pools enough that you could get at it from another place, or is it more impervious to where you really need to be where you are to get to it? So that's more a geological question than anything else.
I'm going to point out in advance that Teresa's a lawyer, not a geologist. So.
I think my understanding is that you can get to it to a certain extent. It depends on the formation, and but there is. I've heard of up to mile-long diagonals under one place that gets to resource in another location. I don't know what the extent of the distance is.
I think we're over 2 miles now, I think.
Yeah, they've done some 3 miles.
Up to 3 in some.
Okay. Did you want to add something?
Well, I'm happy to expound. I think that it's important to realize, as we talk about where and when and if we develop natural gas, from where I sit, our energy future needs to be one that's moving away from fossil fuels ultimately. And, Boulder County has the dubious honor of being home to the worst wildfire in the state at the time and one of the worst floods in the state over a 3-year period. The effects of climate change are real here, and we need to get serious about an energy future that works for this and future generations. And so we are in a transition period of moving away from fossil fuels, I hope, and certainly that's the policies that we're trying to put in place. There is this period of time where we will be using natural gas, and I think that's what this discussion is. How can we do it in a responsible and safe manner as possible? And it is an interesting question, I'll admit, for a county to say, well, where is it okay in this interim period to develop natural gas? That's a fair question to ask, but what is very clear is that we shouldn't be doing it in the middle of residential neighborhoods or next to rivers. I think they're logical places where most people could say that doesn't work. And then maybe there's other places that are more amenable because there's less harm to be done. So yeah, I agree that that's a fodder for discussion for sure.
All right, I think we have time for one or two more questions, and then I've promised each of the panelists they'll have a few minutes to make some closing remarks. But yeah, right there.
Yeah, I was wondering, when you talk about the issue of trust and the industry being able to move towards that, the frac focus and some of the laws around the West have that exception for proprietary interests. So it's as if the industry kind of tells you what they're doing with their frac fluids, but not really. And I think it's kind of hard to ask people to trust the industry when you don't know exactly what it is they're doing. And it seems like, I guess the question is there a disconnect there, particularly when we're, on the one hand, talking about best practices, yet we have the operators kind of hiding from the public and each other their best practices when it comes to the frac process itself.
I guess I'll start. I think it was Mark who mentioned earlier that when they were doing their research, it was some of the well service companies that didn't want to disclose their processes and their products. I don't think the operators generally are trying to hide that, but I don't know what the total picture is on that. And I guess my understanding is that my company has fully disclosed, but again, I don't know if the sensitivity is at the operator level or is it the service company level. I know that when we started our responsible products program, there was a lot of resistance from certain major well service providers that they did not want to follow the program. So again, I'm not sure where the problem is.
Well, I would just add that when we negotiated, the global negotiated the fracking fluid disclosure rule, the trade secret loophole was a huge debate, and a lot of folks walked away from that rulemaking and said, wow, that was a whole bunch of nothing because of that. And it's a difficult thing. I think ideally, we want transparency. We disclose all of the chemicals, and we don't choose, well, gee, that would somehow put me at a disadvantage if some other company knew that we were using this ingredient. I think that the public's right to know trumps that. But that's an ongoing debate. We lost it in Colorado. I think it's one of those, as the industry struggles with transparency and trust issues, that's something that they may want to revisit.
Okay, let's have one last question, and then we'll go to closing statements. And I think Catherine's going to defer to Gary on this.
Well, thank you for that. The idea of achieving a level of trust is very laudable, but what if that isn't achieved? And I actually think the chances are good that we will not. But there's a different pathway that may be productive. Those of us in here that are my age remember a book a while ago called Getting to Yes that basically says if you can't get trust, identify a set of hardcore principles that are rigorous and measurable, and you hold people accountable to those principles. So when you're thinking about your next symposium, if we haven't achieved this level of trust that we want here, you may think about how that approach could be productive in lieu of trust that we would like to achieve.
Great, thanks. All right, well, we've got 10 minutes left for some concluding remarks. And I'm wondering, since Elise and Teresa have been have addressed the last couple of questions, maybe Mark, you'd like to start us out?
Sure. I'm always able to, muster up 5 minutes worth of comments, so I'm happy to try to do that. So let me just sort of raise another issue that I think relates to much of what we've been talking about over the past couple of days, but I don't know that we've talked about it directly. And I would just like to suggest that in thinking about issues like trust and how we allow and promote and deal with oil and gas development, we give some thought to scale and how much development is going on. This sort of goes back to something I said earlier about the regulatory community being reactive and not proactive in dealing with oil and gas development. And it's not unique to oil and gas development. It's just a good example, I think. But we've seen lots of examples throughout the country, and we may be seeing it going global now, where if you watch what's going on, the scale of development just seems out of hand. You can talk about it in terms of the boom-bust cycle. You can talk about it in terms of the nighttime pictures over the Bakken oil fields and the flaring that goes on in those areas. You can talk about it in terms of the truck traffic that comes through tiny communities 24/7. And that to me screams out that we've not done an adequate job of controlling the scale of development. I would be the first to admit that this is not easy to do, that we've got to come up with some creative solutions to do it. I don't think it's the business of government to pick winners and losers as to who gets to develop. But there's got to be a way for us to think about scaling back development to a more reasonable level, allowing development to occur, but allowing it to occur in a way that's much more compatible with living in our communities and minimizing the kinds of impacts that we see. And I don't think we've figured that out yet. And I guess I'd just leave you all with the thought that we really need to give some hard thought to how we manage the scale of development, the scope of development, and trying to figure out strategies for trying to deal with that.
Great, thanks, Mark. Joan, some concluding thoughts.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's fair that I always have to go after the law professor.
Life's not fair.
So I'm going to take it back down. But I guess all I would say is that there's a lot of work that needs to be done, can be done, should be done, and I'm really I'm an optimist. I'm quite encouraged by the level of the discussion here. These kinds of discussions are going on in all of our communities that are faced with these challenges, and they are real challenges. But with respect to EPA's role, we're going to continue to examine it. We're going to continue to identify and pursue opportunities to protect human health and the environment. And we need the public engaged in that as much as we need industry engaged in that. And, you know, I subscribe to the Patty Limerick Challenge. And it's not clever, but I'm pretty sure.
You didn't win either, did you?
I'm pretty sure it's a limerick, and yeah, no, I didn't win. I thought, I thought the contest went through the conference, not just yesterday.
Okay.
But it does reflect my concluding remarks.
Okay,
If
great.
you would bear with me.
Please.
So, at the end of the conference called Marts, we heard info, saw data and charts. With oil and gas, some answers elude, alas. In solutions, we all have our parts.
We might have a backup contest. We'll email Patty.
Just give everyone a Patty's
Yeah,
book.
yeah.
There you go.
All right. Elise?
Well, I want to thank you all for being here. This is going to be a long process, and it's important that people like you are engaged. This issue is not going away. We are entering really unprecedented territory in terms of the level of development and the pace of development, the location of development. And I think you've spent a lot of time hearing over the last 2 days about the level of uncertainty about what are the full impacts of all that, be it on public health, property values, local economies. There are just a lot of questions that are still out there. And I want to encourage you to think about that from the perspective, because I'm a local elected official, from local communities and what that uncertainty feels like. And the fact that the risks involved with that uncertainty are often out of local residents' control. They don't get to decide whether or not they breathe what the well that got put in their backyard or in their neighbor's backyard. They don't get a choice about whether or not they breathe those fumes or whether or not their water's impacted. And so that brings with it a level of anxiety, and and that's what we're seeing out in the public today. And I think we need to acknowledge that and work to address it. And part of the solution, again, I'm a local elected official, you're going to see this one coming, is making sure that local communities have a meaningful seat at the table. And I would argue that to be meaningful, that should include the ability to say no, because that's when the conversations and the mitigations get really honest. So I would encourage us to think about the role and the voice of local residents and local communities as we figure this out. And I also want to agree with Mark on the notion of pace and scale, that is a place where, in particular, local communities should be given the opportunity to say how this might work for us over time and space. One of my favorite economists, who happens to be in the back of the room, Dr. Pete Morton, has done a lot of work about how if we want to maximize benefits associated with energy development and sustainable economies, we have to control the pace and the scale. Boom and bust doesn't work. It doesn't work in terms of the ability of our environment to absorb those kind of impacts. It doesn't work for local economies. It doesn't work for having a sustainable future. So again, thank you for being a part of the conversation, and thank you for thinking about local communities as you look towards solutions on this.
Great. Thank you. Teresa, you have the final word.
Just would like to touch on the communications. I think in the oil and gas industry, probably 15 years ago, we could rely on complying with state and local and federal regulations, and if we did that, we were doing our job. But I think today it's different, and we need to recognize that and continue to reach out to stakeholders, Somebody suggested, maybe it was you, Elise, inviting local residents to come watch monitoring activities and just do a better job at communication.
Great. All right. Well, let's give a big hand for our 4 panelists here.